Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Johan Vergara wash processed Colombia from Bell Lane Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Bell Lane, based out of Mullingar, Ireland. And this is part 4 of our 4-part series featuring the Right Roasts Ireland subscription box. This is also Bell Lane's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. This coffee was actually the biggest wildcard among the set of coffees that we are discussing in this series, mostly because I hadn't had any familiarity with this coffee roaster, but also because the coffee very much sounded like my type of coffee. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how it compared to the other 3, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So it's safe to say that this one was notably lighter than both the Imbibe and Cloud Picker coffees. And interestingly enough, I feel like the best contemporary I have for this coffee was with another coffee roaster that I also believe uses the IMF. I think that this coffee roaster uses the IMF, but that coffee roaster I'm referring to is Prodigal, as I could see a lot of similarities between the profiles of these coffees, which is to say that it's light. It's not necessarily the lightest thing out there, and I feel like maybe it's a little bit more of a kind of modern light medium in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. A 16 first impression, and we ran it through the V60, but the aroma of the brew itself was radiating so many fruit profiles within the cup itself, also offering a wonderfully fruity experience. It's mostly dominated by a slightly bitter citric fruit, but also some wonderfully sweet tropicality as well, lending itself to a very nice first impression. And every single time I brewed this coffee, I was just really impressed by the aroma that was coming from it, as it was so fruity and vibrant just from the brew itself that the cup itself did need to kind of mirror that in order to justify and do this coffee any justice in general. Day 19 through the Chemex, and it was offering a similar experience with a very fruit-forward profile and a tropical sense. Terrific clarity and plenty of brightness with a very clean, defined, sweet, and sugary candied cup. So this one was very pretty once again. I really had some enjoyable first couple of impressions of this coffee. Day 22 through the April brewer, and it was offering more of the same. This time some slightly toned down aspects, as there's a little bit more balance to the fruit, with the citrus being a little bit more even, which was a little bit of a selling point to me on it, given that as of this moment it had been a little bit more abundant and dominant relative to some of the other fruit profiles of this coffee. A slight bit more peachy stone fruit was also present, giving it just some more fruit depth as well. Up to that point it had been a little bit more citric and tropical bright skewing, but this just gave it a little bit more to it. Day 25 through the V60 with Bell Lane's recipe, and Bell Lane really insists on kind of ramping it up, as if I recall correctly, their recipe was just off boil, so all the way up there at those really high temperatures, and it was still nice. I don't want to take away from it, because regardless of how I brewed this coffee, it continued to turn out very nice and fruit forward, but this one skewed a little bit more on the bright and citric side of things, with a little bit more intensity to those aspects of this coffee. It was a little less stable, as it didn't have quite the same level of definition as some of the earlier days we had, but the cup itself was still pretty nice, still pretty fruit forward, just maybe a little bit more in the citric sense. Day 28 through the Chemex with Bell Lane's recipe, and once again it's still very nice, but it's skewing a little bit more on the brighter side of things, with a little bit less of the fruit forward profile relative to some of the previous days. It did cool off very well still, with plenty of the candied sweet aspects to this coffee, as it continued to remain sweet and fruit forward nonetheless. Day 31 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the cup was back to being at its best, with an abundance of the fruit forward aspects yet again. It's sweeter, slightly bitter in terms of that citric quality that remains on the forefront, but it was equaled by a berry-like tropicality and a stone fruit-like aspect. So I referenced that berry-like tropicality. I believe that the other fruit note that they have listed on here is something along the lines of papaya. But in addition to that, I could kind of see it in that slightly Colombian berry sense, which is something I reference a lot of the time. And that's why it did remind me a little bit of Prodigal's coffees in that sense as well, as it still offered plenty of that sweeter aspect to this one as well. Day 34 through the Chemex, and this was actually a very beautiful day, as I can say that this was one of the most Ethiopian-like experiences I've ever had for any Colombian coffee, as it was so clean and defined with such a fruit-forward profile, especially in the peachy sense, that I was just really surprised that this one could still be a Colombian coffee given just how Ethiopian like this one was. Plenty of sweet and candied aspects to it, but I think what really sold me on it was just how much clarity there was, as this was a very clean and well-defined coffee. Day 37, final notes, we have one more try through the Chemex, and this one was once again very Ethiopian-like, as it's very fruit-forward. It's experiencing a wide range of fruit aspects, ranging from that sweeter citrus, and I can say that a lot of the bitterness did seem to dissipate with time. I think that one of the notes they have listed on here is grapefruit, which initially made a lot of sense, but towards the end I could say it was a little bit more of a sweeter citrus, maybe a little bit more of a sweeter grapefruit, or maybe a little bit more of like a tangerine sort of citric sweetness. But in addition to that, the peachiness, which when I was experiencing a fair bit of that peachiness, was absolutely divine. In addition to that, tropical and those darker Colombian berry-like aspects were also present within this one, which made it a very enjoyable fruit-forward experience. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So this one is on the, I want to say slightly cleaner side as level 4, but at the same time, every time I get that ever so slight Colombian berry-like aspect, it does remind me slightly of natural processed coffees. But truth be told, given just how much fruit intensity there is in this coffee, you could maybe even say that it's like a very, very clean natural processed coffee with maybe a slight bit less intensity of the natural processing. But with that being said, it's just very clean relative to what this coffee is, mostly because of the definition of the fruit profiles in this one are very clear, defined, and pronounced. So massive credit to them on that. I really appreciate that part about this coffee. Finish, level 4, and it finishes in a variety of ways, and typically when I get the more peach forward finish to this coffee, it is probably the most enjoyable that I experienced from this coffee in general. But that being said, I think that a lot of the time it kind of finishes in a much more bright and candied sense as well, and that's kind of demonstrated in this tasting wheel. We'll go through those when we get to them. We move on to sweetness level 4, and it's fruit sweet, and that's always a huge selling point to me, is when the sweetness comes specifically in a much more fruit-like direction, then I really enjoy it. Sweeter tropical, sweeter citrus, and sweeter peachiness, so those were all really enjoyable aspects for me. I really appreciate a coffee that does skew in the sweeter side of the fruit profile. Acidity, level 4, it's very bright, and that's a really nice kind of addition to this coffee, because it's something that I didn't even necessarily mention too much throughout, mostly because I was so much more focused on the fruit and sweet side of this coffee that it's kind of neglecting just how much brightness there was in this one. There's plenty of brightness as well, and it comes in the fruit sense once again, so there's just so much brightness and sweetness within this coffee that it just gives it an additional layer of depth, and even more, we'll say, depth than some of the wash processed Ethiopian coffees that we're trying to kind of compare this one to. Berry fruit, level 4. And I mentioned that in a number of directions. So there's that tropical berry that I'd mentioned, but also that kind of Colombian berry, which once again, to describe it, when you have those natural processed Colombian coffees and they have that very heavy berry feel to it, that, but in a much more clean sense to it, that's the best way I can describe it. It's just a little bit of a darker berry tone to this coffee. Those two things kind of justify that being there at that level 4. Citrus, level 4, most prominent and pronounced note early on within this coffee, but I feel like that took a backseat towards the end to the stone fruit, which is at that level 4. And when I'm experiencing the peachy quality of this coffee, it gives it the best overall experience for me, as I really love these peachy coffees, and given that it had this sort of very clean, peachy, washed Ethiopian profile to it, that just added to the overall enjoyment of this coffee. Very lovely in that regard. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the florality, and once again, I think that might be attributed to the fact that this reminded me a fair bit of a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, so a little bit more of the slightly darker floral aspects to this one that kind of coincided with those darker berry tones to this coffee. And then the caramel level 3, which does indicate the candied profile of this coffee, because there was just some wonderful candied aspects to it. And then the final thing worth discussing is the body out of level 2, and that part's kind of interesting to me because I continued to kind of compare this one alongside of a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, and I think that that also kind of helped with this one because it was slightly lighter bodied, and that could have been attributed to the fact that we did brew it with the Chemex. Nonetheless, not necessarily the most amount of texture, but given that it was just kind of replicating the rest of an experience from an Ethiopian coffee, then I have no problem seeing that with this one as well. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. If you didn't pick it up by now, I actually released this series in order of my favorites. So my least favorite was that Imbibe, then the Cloud Picker, and then the Calendar. But this coffee right here was a really nice standout and a really nice surprise. I said that it was a wild card going into it, and I was really just impressed by the way that this one turned out by the end. And it's right up there with that Jose Caro as my favorite wash processed Colombian coffee this year, because both these coffees offer just such wonderfully fruit forward and clean profiles to them with tremendous definition, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. And it hit really well on 3 of the big 4 categories that I look for: cleanliness, wonderful cleanliness; sweetness, wonderful sweetness; and a fruit forward profile. That's essentially what this coffee was fruit forward in so many different directions. So they really seemed to hit this one out of the park. Massive credit to this coffee roaster. I really hope I can get some more of their coffees in the future. Last time I looked at their website, there wasn't anything available, but I'm still very curious to see how the rest of their coffees turn out, as they're certainly on my radar from this point going forward. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you really enjoy your fruit forward coffees with tremendous sweetness, then obviously this is a really nice place to start, especially if you're looking for a little bit more of that peachy sense to it. So somewhat replicating a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, but maybe with a little bit more intensity, because this one was more intense than a wash processed Ethiopian coffee, but still offered a lot of those characteristics. A lot of fruit forward aspects, a lot of sweetness, and a lot of clarity. All of this kind of coming in that more candied sense as well, just making this a very enjoyable experience from start to finish. One of my favorite Colombian coffees this year, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. And if you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Johan Vergara wash processed Colombia from Bell Lane Coffee. Thank you for watching.